It's good to be back speaking with you. I was here about, maybe 7 or 8 years ago talking about initiative referendums. I doubt anybody remembers me, but you're a good group, and I just couldn't wait to come here to talk to you tonight. I'm a retired Air Force intelligence specialist, analyst, and a political activist. I am active with the Texas Board of Volunteers, and I know my good buddy Mike Denholm. We've been on a few watches together out there, and that's one of my causes. Of course, initiative of referendum rights, I would like to see Texas have those, but I was thwarted. And this project I'm going to talk to you tonight, I believe is the most important project of our generation. So, without further ado, let me start off. Last November, Gallup conducted a poll in which they asked the question, in your opinion, which of the following will be the biggest threat to the country in the future? And they gave 3 choices: big business, big labor, or big government. Now, before I put up the slide that shows who got the most votes, I'd like to take a little poll right here. This is a test. How many of you here, by raising your hands, think that big business is the greatest threat to our nation? Got a couple. Okay. How about big labor? Yeah. You said big business. Both of them, right? How about big government? Ah, yeah. You folks are thinking right. You're in the majority if you think it's big government. 72% of Americans feel that the government is the greatest threat to our country. And our founders were very, very wary of a large, too powerful central government and took steps when writing the Constitution to ensure its limits by establishing checks and balances among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Today, however, these checks and balances have all but disappeared. Our federal government has exceeded the boundaries of power given it to our Constitution, and they continue this abuse. And I'm briefly going to discuss, 4 major areas where these abuses occur. And I hope you can all read the slides, right? Good. The $17 trillion national debt is staggering. It's actually about $18 trillion now. But it only tells a part of the story. If we apply the normal rules of business accounting, the federal government owes at least $50 trillion more in vested Social Security benefits and other entitlement programs. This is why the government cannot tax its way out of debt. Even if they confiscated everything owned by private citizens and companies, it would not cover the debt. The federal bureaucracy has placed a regulatory burden upon businesses that is complex, conflicted, and crushing. Little accountability exists when executive agencies, rather than Congress, enact the real substance of the law. Research from the American Enterprise Institute shows that since 1949, federal regulations have lowered the real gross domestic product growth by 2% and have made America 72% poorer. Now, Just to give you an idea, this is a large file cabinet that contains the 80,000 pages of regulations issued by the Obama administration for the year 2013. That's 1 year of regulations. For years, Congress has been using federal grants to keep the states under its control. By attaching mandates to these grants, Congress has turned our state legislatures into their regional agencies, rather than truly independent Republican forms of government. A radical social agenda and an erosion of rights of the people accompany all of this. And although some efforts have been made to combat the social engineering and to protect people's rights, we've missed one of the most important principles of the American founding, and that is state legislatures need to be free to implement the will of the voters of their own states, not the will of Congress. Our founders believed the structures of a limited government would provide the greatest protection of liberty. Those checks and balances that I mentioned earlier were to ensure that everything not specifically granted to Congress for legislative control was to be left to the states and to the people. Unfortunately, collusion among decision makers in Washington has overrun these checks and balances. The federal judiciary supports Congress and the White House in their ever-escalating attack upon the jurisdiction of the 50 states. This is more than an attack on the independence of the states. This robs the people of their most fundamental liberty, the right of self-governance. We need to realize the structures of decision-making matter. Who decides what the law shall be is just as important as what is decided. The protection of liberty requires a strict adherence to the principle that power is both limited and delegated. The federal government does not believe this principle. They continually expand the boundaries of their power. Now, I hate slides that are full of words, but this is one that you have to read. And I hope you can, because I'm looking at the one back there and I can't read it. If I turn around, this is taken in a remarkable admission. The Supreme Court, when rebuffing a constitutional challenge to the federal spending power, acknowledged their approval of programs that violated the will of the founders. This constitutional framework has been sufficiently flexible over the past 2 centuries to allow for enormous changes in the nature of government. The federal government undertakes activities today that would have been unimaginable to the framers in 2 senses. First, because the framers would not have conceived that any government would conduct such activity. Second, because the framers would not have believed that the federal government, rather than the states, would assume such responsibilities. Yet the powers conferred upon the federal government by the Constitution were phrased in language broad enough to allow for the expansion of the federal government's role. And that came from, and I believe, I'm not certain, I think it was Judge Ginsburg. And that was the comment of the majority. That tells it all. To me, that was the most shocking thing I've read lately. These abuses are not mere instances of bad policy. They're driving us towards an age of soft tyranny, in which the government softens, bends, and guides men's wills. If we do nothing to halt these abuses, we run the risk of becoming what Alexis de Tocqueville warned us in 1840. founders gave us a solution, and it's contained in Article 5 of the Constitution. It's called the Convention of States. Many people don't know that there are two methods to propose amendments to the Constitution. Most are familiar with the first method shown on this slide. And basically, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate agree on an amendment. They propose it. It goes to the 50 states. It must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That would be 38. Or it can go to the state legislators or to a convention called by the states. That's up to Congress. But very few know about the second method, which right now should be extremely important to us. During the Constitutional Convention, as the founders were reviewing the revisions being made to the draft Constitution, George Mason of Virginia expressed opposition to the provision that only Congress had the power to propose amendments. Mason thought that, quote, no amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive. In response, a motion was made and carried to amend the article to introduce language requiring that a convention be called when 2/3 of the states applied for an amendment. The most important check to our federal power is this second method. Now, what happens in the second method in the states? Put in an application for a convention. Normally, they put it in for a convention for a particular amendment. If 2/3 of the states submit the same application or an application which basically says the same amendment, then Congress must call a convention of states. They must call it. They don't have an option. The states meet,